In January 1945, the Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe sat down at his typewriter and drafted a message that could have ended the war, not against Germany, but between America and Britain. 5 words changed everything. It is him or me. Dwight Eisenhower, the man famous for his patience, his diplomacy, his ability to smile through any insult, had finally snapped, and the target of his fury wasn't Adolf Hitler. It was Britain's most celebrated general, the hero of El Alamein, the man Winston Churchill called Untouchable. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had just held a press conference, and what he said in front of those reporters nearly shattered the alliance that was winning the war. Here's what makes this story remarkable. Eisenhower had tolerated Montgomery's insults for 3 years. 3 years of being called incompetent. 3 years of having his strategies mocked. 3 years of watching Montgomery strut around like he was the only real soldier in Europe. So what finally pushed the nice guy over the edge? A single press conference. 20 minutes of talking, and the reaction was so severe that within 48 hours, Eisenhower had drafted his resignation. General Omar Bradley had threatened to quit, and Winston Churchill was forced to stand before Parliament and publicly throw his favorite general under the bus. This is the story of how one man's ego nearly destroyed the most important military alliance in modern history, and the forgotten hero who had exactly 24 hours to stop it. To understand why January 1945 became a crisis point, we need to go back to October 1942, because that's when Bernard Montgomery became untouchable. The Second Battle of El Alamein, Montgomery's 8th Army against Rommel's Afrika Corps. For 12 days, the fighting raged across the Egyptian desert, and when it was over, Montgomery had won Britain's first major land victory of the war. Churchill's response became one of the most quoted lines of World War II. Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat. Montgomery became a national hero overnight. The British public adored him. Churchill loved him. Newspapers celebrated him as the greatest soldier Britain had produced in a generation. And Montgomery believed every word of it. He wore distinctive berets, he gave inspirational speeches, he cultivated relationships with the press like a modern celebrity. When he won battles, he made absolutely certain everyone knew exactly who deserved the credit. There was just one problem. Montgomery was convinced, genuinely, deeply convinced, that he was the finest general available to the Western Allies. Not one of the finest, the finest. And if Eisenhower or Bradley or anyone else disagreed, well, that just proved they didn't understand modern warfare. And in private, British officers had a nickname for their American counterparts. They called them our Italians, a dismissive reference suggesting the Americans had good equipment and plenty of resources, but lacked true military sophistication. Montgomery shared this view completely. American generals were enthusiastic amateurs. Brave, certainly. Well supplied, absolutely. But they needed British guidance. They needed his guidance. Meanwhile, Eisenhower was building something Montgomery could never understand. Eisenhower wasn't chosen as supreme commander because he was the most brilliant tactical mind in the Allied forces. He was chosen because he understood something fundamental. This war would be won or lost based on whether the Allies could actually work together. In World War I, Allied forces had operated through a committee system, different national armies pursuing different strategies with different priorities. The result was chaos, confusion, and millions of unnecessary deaths. Eisenhower envisioned something revolutionary, one command, one strategy, with British and American forces truly integrated, not competing, not pursuing separate goals, working together as a single fighting force. This required patience, enormous patience, because the egos involved were massive, the national interests were conflicting, and the personalities were combustible. Eisenhower's approach to Montgomery was essentially this: manage him like a difficult employee who happened to be politically untouchable, give praise when possible, award medals, offer compromises, concede on secondary matters, keep the strategic focus on defeating Hitler. One observer noted that Eisenhower managed Montgomery like a spoiled child. It worked. For 3 years, it worked. Montgomery complained constantly. He criticized Eisenhower's strategies in letters, in meetings, in conversations with anyone who would listen. He told a BBC reporter that Eisenhower was out of his depth and should stick to political matters rather than trying to run actual military operations. Eisenhower absorbed it all. He smiled, he compromised, he kept the alliance together. Then came the Battle of the Bulge, December 16th, 1944. Adolf Hitler launched his last major offensive in the West. German panzer divisions smashed through thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest. The attack was a complete surprise. American units were overrun, communications were severed, a massive wedge, a bulge, appeared in the Allied front line. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, suddenly found himself cut off from two of his armies. The 1st Army and 9th Army were on the northern side of the German breakthrough. Bradley's headquarters was on the southern side. He couldn't effectively coordinate the defense. Eisenhower faced a critical decision. Montgomery's 21st Army Group headquarters was positioned closer to the northern sector. They could coordinate the defense more effectively than Bradley's severed command. Eisenhower made the pragmatic choice, temporarily transfer the 1st and 9th Armies to Montgomery's command until the crisis passed. It was the correct military decision. It was also a decision Eisenhower would come to regret, because Montgomery interpreted this temporary arrangement as something else entirely. In his mind, Eisenhower had finally admitted what Montgomery had been saying for years, that American commanders were incompetent, that American forces had panicked, and that Montgomery was the savior coming to rescue them from their own failure. For the next 10 days, Montgomery's behavior became increasingly insufferable. He visited American headquarters, not to coordinate, but to inspect. He treated General Hodges and General Simpson like schoolboys who had failed their exams. He criticized their defensive positions. He criticized their military bearing. When Eisenhower ordered him to launch a counterattack, Montgomery refused, claiming the conditions weren't suitable. American commanders fighting for their lives in frozen foxholes were furious. They were taking massive casualties. They were holding the line. And Montgomery was sitting in his comfortable headquarters, taking credit and refusing to attack. Then Montgomery did something even worse. He sat down at his typewriter. In late December 1944, while American soldiers were dying around Bastogne, Montgomery began writing letters to Eisenhower. Each letter escalated in its demands. He didn't ask, he demanded. Montgomery argued that the war had been prolonged because there were too many chiefs. He proposed a new command structure. Eisenhower would remain supreme commander, but only as a political figurehead, dealing with presidents and kings. Montgomery himself would become the real land forces commander, exercising direct operational control over every Allied soldier on the continent. On December 29th, Montgomery sent his culminating letter. The tone was breathtakingly condescending. I suggest that your directive should finish with this sentence. From now on, full operational direction, control, and coordination of these operations is vested in the C&C 21 Army Group, Montgomery. Translation: sign here to give me your job. When Eisenhower read this letter, his hand shook. He showed it to his deputy, Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder, a British officer. Tedder's response was immediate. I support you, Ike. Fire him. He showed it to General Omar Bradley. Bradley, known for his calm demeanor and diplomatic approach, turned red with anger. If you give him that command, Bradley said, you can have my resignation immediately. General George Patton's diary entries from this period cannot be reproduced in polite company. Patton remarked, only partially joking, that if he saw Montgomery, he might shoot him. The crisis had suddenly become apocalyptic. If Eisenhower gave Montgomery what he wanted, he would lose his best American commanders. Bradley would resign. Patton might actually commit violence. The American officer corps would fracture. American troops, who had done most of the fighting and taken most of the casualties in the Bulge, would never accept serving under the British general who was claiming credit for their sacrifice. If Eisenhower fired Montgomery, Churchill would be furious. The British public would view it as an American insult to their national hero. The British government might reduce its commitment to the campaign. The Anglo-American alliance, the foundation of everything, could shatter. Every option led to disaster. And then Montgomery made it worse. January 7th, 1945. The German offensive was stalling. Patton's Third Army had accomplished a brilliant relief of besieged Bastogne. American forces had held the line, absorbed over 70,000 casualties, and were now pushing the Germans back. Montgomery called a press conference. His stated intention was noble. He wanted to explain the battle to the world and support Eisenhower against criticism from the British press. He had prepared notes. He planned to be diplomatic. Montgomery, however, had a fatal weakness. When he had an audience, he found it nearly impossible to resist elevating his own role in events. He wore his distinctive maroon paratrooper beret with 2 badges. He stood before the assembled reporters, and he began to speak. "When I saw what was happening," Montgomery told them, "I took certain steps myself to ensure that if the Germans got to the Meuse, they would certainly not get over the river. I took control of the situation. I tidied up the battlefield." He described American soldiers as brave, but essentially as pieces he had moved around a chessboard. He barely mentioned General Bradley. He barely mentioned General Patton. He spoke as if the entire American effort had been disorganized chaos until his guiding hand imposed order. The British press seized upon this narrative. Headlines announced how Monty saved the day for the Americans, how British tactical genius had rescued the Americans from their own incompetence. The message that the British public received was simple. Americans messed up. Monty fixed it. The reaction in Washington was volcanic. General George Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, sent a cable implying that this was the final straw. Congressional representatives received complaints from American officers demanding Montgomery's removal. General Bradley stopped attending meetings with British officers. According to some accounts, he literally refused to be in the same room with Montgomery. And the German High Command, watching this unfold, recognized an opportunity they couldn't resist. German radio began rebroadcasting Montgomery's press conference statements. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were weaponizing Montgomery's own words against the Anglo-American alliance. The Nazis were using a British general's ego to fracture the forces defeating them. Eisenhower had finally reached his limit. For 3 years, he had swallowed his pride. He had accepted the insults. He had tolerated the lectures delivered as if he were a slow-witted student who couldn't grasp basic military concepts. He had genuinely believed, that defeating Hitler was more important than his own ego. Montgomery had made a fatal miscalculation. He had mistaken Eisenhower's patience for weakness. The famous Grin disappeared. Eisenhower went to his private quarters on his mobile train headquarters. He sat down with a typewriter, and he drafted a cable to the Combined Chiefs of Staff, the highest military authority in both Washington and London. The draft cable was not polite. It was not a request for clarification. It was a resignation threat and an ultimatum. The message stated, in effect, the differences between Field Marshal Montgomery and me are unbridgeable. Our concepts of command are opposite. You must choose. If you want his plan, I resign. If you want me, he goes. 5 words captured everything. It is him or me. Eisenhower understood the political calculus perfectly. If forced to choose, the combined chiefs would have to choose him. America was providing the preponderance of men, material, and resources. American industrial production was keeping the war effort alive. Montgomery, however talented, could not be worth fracturing the alliance or losing American commitment. Churchill would scream. Churchill loved Montgomery. Churchill would defend his favorite general with characteristic passion. Churchill would also ultimately have to accept the decision because Britain's war effort depended on American support, and Eisenhower controlled the massive American military and industrial resources that were winning the war. The Supreme Commander of Allied forces was preparing to fire the most celebrated British general of World War II. History remembers Eisenhower and Montgomery. The textbooks focus on their rivalry, their conflicting strategies, their clash of personalities. Almost no one remembers the man who actually prevented catastrophe. Major General Sir Freddie de Guingand had served as Montgomery's chief of staff since El Alamein. He understood his boss's strengths. More importantly, he understood his boss's weaknesses. De Guingand was everything Montgomery was not: diplomatic, politically astute, likable. He had built strong professional relationships with American officers, particularly Eisenhower's deputy, General Bedell Smith. Most critically, de Guingand understood politics. He grasped the broader implications of decisions in ways that Montgomery, focused on military matters and his own reputation, simply could not comprehend. De Guingand heard the rumors circulating through Allied headquarters. He saw the fury in American officers' eyes. He sensed the crisis building toward explosion. And he realized something Montgomery didn't. Montgomery was about to be fired. Not threatened, not warned. Actually fired. Montgomery had no idea. He genuinely believed he was winning the argument. He remained convinced that Eisenhower needed him, that once the smoke cleared, Montgomery would emerge triumphant with expanded command authority. De Guingand rushed to Eisenhower's headquarters. The weather was abysmal, frozen, snowing, bitter, cold. He arrived exhausted, his uniform soaked, his face red from the wind. He burst into Eisenhower's office just as the Supreme Commander was finalizing the firing order. Eisenhower's face was white with controlled rage. His voice was steady but deadly serious. "It's no use, Freddie," Eisenhower said. "I'm tired of it. I can't work with him anymore. I'm asking the chiefs to relieve him." De Guingand could see the cable sitting on the desk, the him or me ultimatum, ready to be sent. De Guingand was a quick thinker. He understood that if this cable was transmitted, it would become public knowledge. The controversy would dominate headlines on both sides of the Atlantic. The British public would view it as an American betrayal. Churchill would be forced to defend Montgomery or accept humiliation. The political fallout would be catastrophic regardless of who was technically right. De Guingand made his plea. "Give me 24 hours, he said. "Let me go to him. Let me show him this cable. I don't think he realizes how angry you are. If he doesn't retract everything in 24 hours, then you can fire him." Eisenhower, still the pragmatist, despite his fury, paused, considered, agreed. "You have 24 hours. De Guingand drove back through the terrible weather, frozen, exhausted, racing against a deadline that would determine whether the Anglo-American alliance survived intact. When he entered Montgomery's tactical headquarters, he found the Field Marshal sitting there looking smug and satisfied. "Hello, Freddie," Montgomery greeted him cheerfully. "Everything is going swimmingly, isn't it?" De Guingand didn't sit down. "Sir," he said, "it is not going swimmingly. It is over. Eisenhower is firing you." Montgomery laughed. He genuinely didn't believe it. "Ike, fire me? He wouldn't dare. He needs me. I'm the only general who can stop the Germans." De Guingand began laying out the evidence. He explained the reaction in Washington, congressional fury, Marshall's cold cables, the American military establishment united in opposition. He told Montgomery about Bradley's threat to resign. Not a bluff, not posturing. Bradley had stated clearly that he would not serve under Montgomery's command. Period. He explained that Eisenhower had drafted a cable to the combined chiefs of staff, an ultimatum. Either Montgomery goes, or Eisenhower himself would resign. Then de Guingand delivered the most devastating blow. Churchill had already signaled, through back channels, that he would side with Eisenhower if forced to choose. The Prime Minister would not sacrifice the American partnership to protect one general, however beloved. De Guingand looked his commander directly in the eye. "You are alone. You have no support. You have insulted every American general. Unless you apologize immediately, you will be on a plane to England tomorrow, retired in disgrace." For the first time in the war, the color drained from Montgomery's face. The arrogance evaporated. The certainty vanished. He realized he had completely misread the situation. He wasn't the master strategist who had just won a political victory. He was the subordinate who had pushed too far and was about to face the consequences. "What do I do, Freddie?" Montgomery whispered. De Guingand had already prepared the solution. He had drafted an apology letter for Montgomery to sign. The letter needed to express complete subordination, complete acceptance of Eisenhower's authority, and complete retraction of the demand for command. The letter Montgomery sent to Eisenhower the next morning is remarkable considering the source. This was a man who had spent 3 years criticizing Eisenhower's competence. 3 years mocking his military knowledge, 3 years arguing that Americans were undertrained amateurs who needed British supervision. Survival instinct, however, is a powerful thing. Montgomery's letter read, "Dear Ike, I have been thinking about our conversation. I am distressed that my letter may have upset you. Whatever your decision may be, you can rely on me 100% to make it work. You will hear no more on the subject of command from me, your very devoted subordinate, Monty." The critical word was subordinate. Not friend, not partner, not colleague, subordinate. That was the word Eisenhower needed to see. That was the acknowledgement of proper chain of command. That was the surrender. When Eisenhower received the letter, he read it twice. He did not gloat. He did not hold a grudge. He did not extract further humiliation or demand public admission of error. He simply picked up the him or me cable he had drafted to the combined chiefs of staff, and he crumpled it up, and he threw it in the trash. He replied to Montgomery with a single cable. "Thank you. Let's get on with the war." The crisis had been averted between commanders. Churchill now had to repair the damage with the public. He learned of the situation through urgent cables from Washington. He read accounts of Montgomery's press conference. He understood the American fury, Bradley's threat, Patton's rage, congressional anger, Marshall's coldness. Churchill was in an impossible position. He loved Montgomery personally. He was proud of Montgomery as a British national hero. He viewed Montgomery as one of the finest soldiers the nation had produced. Supporting Montgomery publicly would play well with the British people. Churchill also understood something fundamental. Britain's survival in the war depended entirely on the American partnership. Without American men, American supplies, American industrial production, Britain would lose, the Allies would lose, the war would be lost. Montgomery's arrogance threatened the entire partnership. Churchill chose the alliance over Montgomery's ego. On January 18, 1945, Churchill stood before the House of Commons. The speech he delivered was carefully constructed to acknowledge British contributions, while unambiguously establishing that this was primarily an American battle won by American soldiers. The United States troops have done almost all the fighting and have suffered almost all the losses, Churchill told Parliament. Care must be taken in telling our proud tale not to claim for the British Army an undue share of what is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war, and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory. The Americans have engaged 30 or 40 men for every one we have engaged, and they have lost 60 to 80 men for every one of ours. General Eisenhower has conducted this battle with great skill and determination. He has my complete confidence. Churchill was publicly throwing Montgomery under the bus. He was making clear that Britain recognized American primacy in this victory, that British claims to credit were subordinate to American ones, that the British government fully supported Eisenhower, and the speech was emergency damage control. It worked. American anger diminished. Bradley withdrew his resignation threat. Patton's fury cooled. The alliance, though strained and scarred, remained intact. Montgomery never recovered politically from the crisis. A few weeks later, command of the 1st and 9th U.S. Armies was returned to Bradley. Things were never the same afterward. Eisenhower sidelined Montgomery for the remainder of the war. The main thrust into Germany, the glory of crossing the Rhine, the prestige of linking up with Soviet forces, was given to Bradley and Patton. Montgomery was assigned to mop up operations in the north. Important work certainly, but unglamorous. Far from the headlines. Bradley extracted a promise from Eisenhower. Montgomery would never again command American forces except in the most extreme emergency. Eisenhower agreed. The damage to personal relationships was permanent. Bradley refused to be in the same room with Montgomery unless Eisenhower was present to mediate. American generals who had previously merely tolerated Montgomery now actively despised him. De Guingand, the man who had actually saved the alliance, received little public recognition. He faded into relative obscurity after the war. History books mention him briefly, if at all. His 24-hour intervention, perhaps the most consequential diplomatic mission of the entire Western European campaign, remains largely unknown outside academic circles. Eisenhower's handling of the Montgomery crisis demonstrates something often overlooked about his command. He wasn't a brilliant tactical innovator like Napoleon. He wasn't an inspired battlefield commander like Patton. He possessed a capability those men lacked: the ability to hold together a fractious alliance of enormous egos and point them in the same direction. For 3 years, Eisenhower tolerated the intolerable. He absorbed insults that would have gotten most subordinates fired. He accepted insubordination. He compromised when Montgomery demanded and retreated when Montgomery pushed. He did this deliberately. He understood that the cost of removing Montgomery politically would be higher than the cost of tolerating his behavior militarily. When the moment came to draw a line, Eisenhower showed steel. He was willing to resign rather than accept dictation. He was willing to fire the most celebrated British general of the war if necessary. Sometimes the patient man, when truly pushed, becomes the most dangerous man in the room. And when Montgomery finally submitted, Eisenhower showed magnanimity. He didn't extract revenge. He didn't demand public humiliation. He crumpled up the ultimatum and threw it away. That's coalition leadership. Knowing when to bend, knowing when to break, and knowing when to simply move forward. Montgomery spent the rest of his life defending his record. He published memoirs, he gave interviews, he insisted, until his death in 1976, that his narrow front strategy could have ended the war months earlier. Eisenhower never publicly criticized Montgomery after the war. He wrote his own memoirs, maintained his dignity, and went on to become President of the United States. The crumpled cable, the him or me ultimatum, was never sent, but its existence proved something that Montgomery never truly accepted. There's a limit to what even the most patient man will tolerate, and when that limit is reached, the choice becomes very simple: shut up or get out.